And welcome back to Hot Laps here on 970 WDAY. A lot of history goes on in various parts of our country when it comes to racing, and Northeast Minnesota is no different from anybody else. Joining us right now is David Aho from the Hibbing area. And David, first of all, thanks a lot for taking some time with me. And we're going to talk about some history for Northeast Minnesota racing, and it's pretty rich.
Yes, it is. And it's my pleasure to speak to you about it. It's a very entertaining subject, I find.
Well, you and me both. Well, let's talk about it. You're starting up a section with the Historical Society where you can talk about the racing, starting not only in Hibbing, but also in other locations in Northeast Minnesota. Tell us more about it.
Okay. I started this project a few years ago, but in the last year it has become basically a full-time occupation. I'm semi-retired. And what I did over the past year was I spent a lot of time at the Iron Range Research Center looking at all of the old newspapers on microfilm. And I've so far gone through 60 years worth of newspapers, page by page, to ferret out all of the stories about our early history, which most people have forgotten or didn't know about in the first place. A couple of the things that I realized from the beginning is that it would be best if I started right from the very beginning of motorsports in this area. So I began with the year 1906.
Really? 1906?
Yes. 1906 was the year that the first Hibbing Raceway was built. We are currently using the second Hibbing Raceway. But the first Hibbing Raceway was built at a place called Pool Location. And for the first 3 years, they conducted races for horses, motorcycles, and motorcycles with sidecars. It wasn't until 1910 that the Hibbing Raceway had their first automobile race. And they had many, many backers in this area who were very fond of automobile racing, and they worked very hard at growing the program. And by 1915, there began a sort of an annual trek to our track up here by the IMCA sprint cars. They were called big cars at that time. Now today we would refer to them as sprint cars. But we had, starting in 1915, an absolutely stellar list of some of the greatest drivers and cars coming every year to Hibbing to compete. That list of people who have been here would include 26 drivers that are currently in the National Sprint Car Hall of Fame.
Oh, wow.
4 Indy 500 winners and 1 Daytona 500 winner have all competed on the Hibbing track.
Oh, you got to tell me who these guys are right now then, if you can.
Yes. Well, going back to the earliest days, people like Tommy Milton came here a couple of times, and a long list of people. Maybe some names that you might be more familiar with is in the 1930s, Gus Schrader and Emery Collins were kind of a fixture here every year. But in more recent times, Tommy Milton, who was here in 1921, won the Indy 500 twice in that time period. And then in 1952, Bill Holland won a feature race in Hibbing. He had won the 1949 Indy 500. And then in 1959, Parnelli Jones ran in Hibbing, and of course he had won the Indy 500. And the last one was Johnny Rutherford, who competed here in 1962 and was a 3-time Indy 500 winner.
That is something. So, that's a huge list of people that are synonymous when it comes to racing. And when we talk about the sprint cars, a lot of us are familiar with the winged sprints. Now, these were the wingless ones, I understand?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I haven't even gotten that current in my history to the point where wings were added to cars. The history part that I'm working on right now, I'm only up into the mid-1960s, and it's taken a long time just to get to that point. There have been some rather interesting things, very notable things. In July of 1934, the IMCA Barnstormers, I guess you could call them, were scheduled to come to Hibbing, and track officials here had a goal, and their goal was to set a world's record for the fastest time ever turned on a half-mile dirt track.
Oh, boy.
And they worked on the track continuously for 2 weeks, getting it prepared. And then it was on the 4th of July, 1934, a large contingent of IMCA drivers showed up, and Gus Schrader, who was a many-time national champion, set the fastest time that had ever been turned on a half-mile dirt track anywhere in the world. And that was followed by another record set by Emery Collins, who set the fastest time for a 1 mile distance, or 2 laps, fastest time in the world. And so on that day, the Hibbing Raceway became the fastest dirt track in the world.
Unbelievable. Do you remember the times on those speeds and stuff?
Yeah, I think, if I recall, Gus Schrader did it in 26.2 seconds, and Emery Collins' 2 laps was 54.2 seconds, I think.
Now, you got to remember, this is 1934, and, you know, and when you also look at it, this is really deep in the, Depression era. And so it was, it was very uncommon. I was thinking that racing would kind of take a back seat back then because of the Depression.
Well, this was a bit of a hotbed of racing back in those days. It still is, I guess you could say. On that 4th of July in 1934, there was an attendance in the grandstands that was in excess of 6,000 people. We don't come anywhere near that in modern-day racing on these small dirt tracks. That was a really big crowd. But in the earlier years, I have seen crowd counts as high as 20,000 people that attended a race, and that would be unheard of, today on a small dirt track, especially way up in the north like we are.
Yeah, and we're talking Hibbing had 20 grand of people in the stands at that time.
Well, they couldn't even fit them in the stands. They were lining the racetrack on the outside of the fence all the way around.
Oh wow. I bet the insurance rate would have been pretty high if it was going back if that happened today. But
yes.
But when we go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say when you started the racing, of course, it was probably on the old horse track, as you mentioned, because horse racing and the motorcycle and so forth. So you're looking at what, a half, or was it a 5/8 or just a half?
It was a half mile.
It was a half mile. Okay, now you said that was the first track. What happened to the second? What's the second track is the one you have right now, I do believe.
Yes. What happened was 1924 was the last year that the original Hibbing Raceway functioned. They needed to move. It was also part of the North St. Louis County Fairgrounds. They needed to move the location because the mining companies were going to mine the iron ore that was right underneath the track. And in fact, that location for the original track is in the middle of the Hull Rust pit today. So they began in 1925 to build a new track at the current location right now. And strangely enough, the original plan was to build a 1 mile dirt oval with a half-mile dirt oval inside of it and an airstrip with hangars between the two tracks for air shows.
Wow. That's kind of like what Dover is right now, because they got the Monster Mile inside and then they got a track inside of it. And I think that's for horse racing. But, wow, a mile long with the hangars on both ends. Unbelievable. Yeah,
they were thinking rather big. In those days, the track officials here and the city fathers, you could say, were very interested in promoting motorsports. We've had events held up here that were actually advertised nationally from coast to coast. They really did a fantastic job of promoting these races back in those days. There is one other rather notable event, maybe one of the more important things that ever happened here. In 1916, there was an official IndyCar race held in Hibbing.
Are you serious?
I am absolutely serious. Wow. I have all the documentation on it. It was sanctioned by the AAA, who also sanctioned all of the Indianapolis races at that time. And it was for a road race with a 100-mile length to it. And what the city fathers did is they laid out a temporary street circuit that was 10 miles in length, and the race was then 10 laps. And to show you how official this was, there's a gentleman by the name of Chester S. Ricker. He was head of timing and scoring at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. In fact, he set up the original timing and scoring system for the very first Indy 500 in 1911. But on the 4th of July in 1916, Mr. Ricker was in Hibbing to officiate at the event. And one of the ways I know that happened is I was able to acquire his handwritten notes from that day.
Oh, really?
Really. I found them in the estate of well-known motorsports book publisher. So I was able to acquire him. But the story doesn't really end there. It was a local man from Chisholm, which is right next door to Hibbing, won the race easily, driving a Stutz. And his name was Elmer T. Shannon. He was actually a pretty well-known car builder and driver back in those days. Well, what happened was, in early 1919, Elmer Shannon acquired a Duesenberg race car. And he designed and built his own motor and put it in that Duesenberg. And in the beginning of May 1919, he brought his car to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And he qualified it in 29th position. He is credited with a 13th place finish in that race, but he was not driving the car at the end of the race. What happened was unbelievably bizarre. He was nearly killed in the freakiest accident that has ever occurred at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Really bizarre event. Near the end of the race, Lewis Chevrolet, and that would be the Chevrolet, was right in front of Elmer Shannon coming out of turn 4. And at that point, Louis' car threw a wheel, and he was able to gather it up. It looked like he was going to crash, but he kept the car under control. And something happened when he crossed the start-finish line, because Mr. Rickers, head of timing and scoring, had stretched a thin copper wire across the track right at the start-finish line, which was connected to a brand-new electronic scoring machine. And as the cars passed over that wire, they would trigger the machine. Well, when Louis' car crossed the wire, the jagged hub that was left from his broken wheel cut that wire. That wire had been stretched under very, very high tension, and when he cut the wire, it recoiled, and as luck would have it, Elmer Shannon was right behind him, and that wire hit him in the neck.
Wow.
It severed his jugular vein.
Holy man.
He said later that he thought it was just a bee sting, and he continued on. Well, that's 2.5 miles all the way around so he can get back into the pits. Well, by the time he got into the pits, his hands and arms and legs had gone numb from blood loss.
Oh, wow.
And it was only very quick work by track personnel that saved his life. But you will find many accounts that will list Elmer Shannon as the 4th fatality in that race. There had been 3 people killed before his accident. In fact, I have a 1920 newspaper headline from a Wisconsin newspaper that said simply, "Shannon alive," which was news. So that's an interesting little part of our history here.
Of course, we're talking with David Aho about the history of Northeast Minnesota racing. And David, when it comes to the present day, things are a little bit different now. Everything's more box shoe or horse, box, more like a shoe box. Late models are pretty prevalent in Hibbing at this time. Yes,
we have a real good contingent of late model drivers and owners from this area. And also our A-mods are doing quite well. In Hibbing, we run the late models, A-mods, Midwest mods, super stocks, and pure stocks. So there's no shortage of cars here on any given Saturday night.
So what do you think of the history of racing or the future of racing? Do you think it's going to still stay strong in that area?
I do, but I am only cautiously optimistic. The economy always plays a role, of course, and there is much more competition for your entertainment time and your entertainment dollars. You have more options to choose from than you did, say, before people had televisions in their homes.
Sure.
So I think that tracks have to be very careful how they promote themselves and how they run their events if they're to maintain their crowd counts as they are or try to grow them. It's much more difficult to do today than it was, say, 30 or 40 years ago. I'm hoping that with my project, getting the history of the motorsports in this area out to the public may create a little interest, and it's possible we could pick up a few more fans to fill the stands just because of that really interesting history.
Well, just the history alone on it, David, is when we talk about, the Indy 500 winners that have raced in Hibbing, the Daytona 500 winner, the story you told us about Mr. Shannon. I mean, who will not sit back to go, wow, this is pretty cool?
Yeah, that was my take on it. I can tell you, when I first started looking at the old newspapers on microfilm, I had absolutely no idea any of these types of events ever were held. And in fact, I have yet to meet a single person that remembered that Parnelli Jones raced in Hibbing in 1959. So this was completely lost history, and I can't count the number of times when I would come to a page in one of the old papers that my jaw would just simply drop. I would be stunned by what I was reading, and I am continually asking myself this question: how is it that nobody knows a thing about this early history? It's a little bit baffling, actually. So I think my role in this is to ferret out as much of that history as I can and get it in front of the public and let them look at it.
Well, David, where can we find out more information? I understand you have a website or a Facebook page. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, the website is just started to upload it. It's at racehibbing.com, all one word. But currently I have a lot more activity on my Facebook page, and that would be facebook.com/racehibbing. I'm generally putting 3 or 4 postings up every day, and much of this information is on there, including a video I finally finished producing. I just loaded up yesterday that covers the first 30 years of motorsports in this area.
Wow.
That people may find interesting, and that's on the Facebook page.
Now, being on Facebook, as we close up shop here pretty soon here, Dave, when you have it on Facebook, have you found other people from other parts of the country that may have been in the Hibbing area saying, hey, I remember this, or I remember I was at that race, or so forth and so on? I know it's pretty early, but has anything like that happened yet?
Oh, yeah, and it has been amazing. I've had response from 26 different countries. Not just the United States, 26 different countries. I've had folks that have written in or made comments on something they saw here. That really took me by surprise.
You bet. Okay, so if anybody wants to find out more, go to those Facebook pages and repeat those for us again as we close up shop here. Where can we find this information? On Facebook and online?
Yes, online at www.racehibbing.com and www.facebook.com/race.
I appreciate the time very much, David, and a continued success on your adventure to get the history of the Northeast Minnesota racing. And once you get things going, are you going to have it in a location like at the Historical Society or the County Historical Society, or is it going to be somewhere else?
I'm working on that right now. Believe it or not, I happen to own an old steam locomotive roundhouse. It's actually in Hibbing. I purchased some years ago. It was built in 1906. It was large enough to service 9 locomotives at a time. And my current goal is to find a way to put a motorsports history center in what was the machine shop of the Mitchell Engine House is what it's called. There's actually information about that on the racehibbing.com site as well. Alrighty,
sounds great. David, it's been a pleasure talking about this, and I love history and I love racing, so it was like 2 great things in one. I appreciate your time, David.
You bet. My pleasure.
All